We're ready.
Okay, are we started? Good. All right, we're going to read a book today called If You're Not From the Prairie. It's by David Bouchard, and I want you to think about, while you're listening to the book, is there anything that you really like about where we live, or that you find really hard about where we live? I want you to think a little bit today about where you live, and maybe even some things that have happened to you, because we're going to be writing a story this week about our lives, about something in our life that has happened. It's called a personal narrative. You probably wrote some of those. How many of you wrote a personal narrative or two last year where you wrote a story about yourself? Okay, sometimes it's a memory story, and sometimes it's a good story, and sometimes it's not so good story, but we're going to write a little bit about an event that happened in your life. So anyway, I want you to be thinking about that while you listen to the story, If You're Not From the Prairie, and see what you think about it. This is the picture in the beginning of the book, and it just says, if you're not from the prairie. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the sun. You can't know the sun. Diamonds that bounce off crisp winter snow, warm waters and dugouts and lakes that we know. The sun is our friend from when we are young. A child of the prairie is part of the sun. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the sun. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the wind. You can't know the wind. Our cold winds of winter cut right to the core. Hot summer wind devils can blow down the door. As children, we know when we play any game, the wind will be there, yet we play just the same. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the wind.
Nice to know, buddy.
What?
Nice to know, buddy.
Anybody notice anything so far?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read one more stanza. I want you to listen. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the sky. You can't know the sky. The bold prairie sky is clear, bright, and blue, though sometimes cloud messages give us a clue. Monstrous gray mushrooms can hint of a storm, or painted pink feathers say goodbye to the warm. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the sky. So what do you notice? Ava?
They keep saying if you're not from the prairie.
Okay, there's repeated language, and a lot of times in a poem, an author will repeat something. There's a lot of repetition. Anything else?
It's rhyming.
It's rhyming. Okay, it rhymes. What about text structure? Anybody notice how the author might have structured this or organized it? Do you remember the 5 types of text structure from last week? We had descriptive. What were some of the other ones?
Sequence,
Cause and effect, compare and contrast.
problem and solution.
Right, problem and solution. So there's all 5 of them. Anybody recognize something from this? What do you think? Listen again. The bold prairie sky is clear, bright, and blue, though sometimes cloud messages give us a clue. What do you think, Ava?
It has description.
It has description. Very good. And the description on each page is in the second stanza. Okay? Good job. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know what's flat. You've never seen flat. When travelers pass through across our great plain, they all view our home. They all say the same. It's simple and flat. They've not learned to see the particular beauty that's now part of me. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know what's flat. If you're not from the prairie, you've not heard the grass. You've never heard grass. In strong summer winds, the grains in grass bend and sway to a dance that seems never to end. It whispers its secrets, they tell of this land, and the rhythm of life played by nature's own hand. If you're not from the prairie, you've never heard grass. Tell me an example of something that you hear there that we've maybe talked about lately, about when an object that can't do something that a human or a person does in the words, the author has them do has it do something that a person does. What do we call that, Dodge? Do you remember? You know what I'm talking about though, don't you?
Onomatopoeia.
No, that's a sound word.
Oh. Literature.
What do we hear when an object does something that a person does? We call it
Fiction.
personification. Y'all remember that?
I didn't remember it.
Okay, we may not have talked about that in this class last week. We talked about that in one of the other classes. But personification is when you give an object something that a human can do. So here they're saying that the grains in the grass sway to a dance. Can grass actually dance? No, it can't do what a human can do or a person can do.
It could dance as the wind blew it.
It does look like it dances, and that's why they use that kind of language. So you're not from the prairie, and yet you know snow? You think you know snow? Blizzards bring danger, as legends have told. In deep drifts we roughhouse, ignoring the cold. At times we look out at a great sea of white, so bright as the sun that we squeeze our eyes tight. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know snow.
Yes, we do. Snow's thick. Snow is cold.
If you're not from the prairie, you don't know our trees. You can't know our trees. The trees that we know to have taken so long to live through our seasons, to grow tall and strong. They're loved and they're treasured. We watched as they grew. We knew they were special. The prairie has few. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know our trees.
Noise.
Yes.
I used to have this giant willow tree, and my mom and dad said, but before we started building here, that willow tree was there before we started building it. And then they said they're sad that it was dying. We had to cut it down because we were afraid it's gonna die and fall on our house. So we had to cut it down. And
Hey, I'm glad you made that connection. You know, some trees grow faster than others, but in the prairie, what this author is saying that trees grow how? Slowly.
that's how the willow tree.
Still, you're not from the prairie, and yet you know cold. You say you've been cold? Of all those memories we share when we're old, none are more clear than the hard, bitter cold. You'll not find among us a soul who can say, I've conquered the wind on a cold winter's day. If you're not from the prairie, you don't know the cold. You've never been cold.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not from the prairie, you don't know me. You can't know me. You see? My hair is mostly wind. My eyes filled with grit. My skin's red or brown. My lips chapped and split. What happened right there between those two pages? He grew up. Okay, so we saw an example of a flash forward. A flash forward is what we call that in writing. Flashback is when you go back in time, but when you go forward in time, it's a flash forward. I've lain on the prairie and heard grasses sigh. I've stared at the vast open bowl of the sky. I've seen all those castles and faces and clouds. My home is the prairie, and I cry out loud. If you're not from the prairie, you can't know my soul. You don't know our blizzards. You've not fought our cold. You can't know my mind, nor ever my heart, unless deep within you there's somehow a part of these things that I said that I know, the wind, sky, and earth, the storms, and the snow. Best say you have, and then we'll be one, for we will have shared that same blazing sun. Do you think this author knows the prairie really well?
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that he has strong feelings about where he lives, where he grew up?
Mm-hmm.
He says this in the back, it's a quotation. It had been less than 2 years since I had moved away from the prairie. It had been 2 years since I heard a friend describe the day as being awfully cold. I remember looking up at him to see him standing there wearing a sweater. He called the day awfully cold while wearing nothing but a sweater? You're joking, I remember saying. He hadn't been. This was the cue I needed to silence those who didn't understand that we from the prairie are what we are and who we are because of the cold, wind, and sun. I knew others had experienced cold and wind, but I doubted they had known mine. Could anyone understand what I was without having shared my dust, my wind, and my blizzard? been 4 years since I wrote If You're Not From the Prairie, and I still doubt it. Okay, you can stop it now.